Peeves the Poltergeist lived in Hogwarts for nearly 1,000 years, born from the chaos and energy of young magical minds, a spirit of mischief who never appeared in any of the 8 films despite haunting every corridor in the books. He dropped water balloons on unsuspecting first years, loosened chandeliers during OWL examinations, and sang rude songs about teachers that echoed through the castle at midnight. The Bloody Baron was the only one who could control him, speaking to Peeves in whispers that made the poltergeist go silent and sullen. When Umbridge tried to impose her tyrannical order on the castle, Peeves became an ally to the students, unscrewing chandeliers at Fred and George's request, a moment of rebellion the films never captured. His voice carried through stone walls, his laughter bounced off armor, and his presence made Hogwarts feel alive in ways that went beyond education and into pure, anarchic magic. The castle breathed differently with Peeves in it, less like a school and more like a living thing with its own wild heartbeat. Winky the house-elf appeared in Goblet of Fire's pages but vanished entirely from the screen, a tragic figure who revealed the darkness hidden in wizard-elf relations. She belonged to Barty Crouch Sr., bound by loyalty so deep she would do anything he commanded, even guarding his son while he hid under an invisibility cloak at the Quidditch World Cup. When Crouch freed her for a crime she didn't commit, Winky fell into despair, drinking butterbeer until she could barely stand, weeping in the Hogwarts kitchens where Dobby tried to comfort her. Her addiction showed the terrible cost of freedom given without consent, how house-elves defined themselves through service and lost their sense of self when that service was taken away. The films removed her entirely, erasing a storyline that complicated the simple narrative of freedom being inherently good. Winky sat in the kitchens wearing a tea towel like a toga, her eyes perpetually wet, her small hands clutching a bottle, a reminder that liberation forced upon someone who doesn't want it can be its own form of cruelty. Hermione founded the Society for the Promotion of Elfish Welfare in her 4th year, knitting hats and socks to hide around Gryffindor Tower, hoping to trick house-elves into picking them up and becoming free. The other students mocked her, calling it pointless, but Hermione persisted with the fierce determination that would later drive her career at the Ministry. She researched elf rights in the library, subscribed to campaign newsletters, and tried to organize protests, only to find that the house-elves themselves resented her interference. They refused to clean Gryffindor Tower because they were offended by the hidden clothes, leaving Dobby to do all the work since he was the only elf who wanted freedom. The films cut this subplot entirely, reducing Hermione's character to someone who solved puzzles and supported Harry, erasing her passionate activism and foreshadowing of her future work in magical creature rights. Her SPEW badges sat in her dormitory, handmade with careful lettering, symbols of a campaign the world wasn't ready to hear, but that Hermione believed in anyway, even when everyone told her she was wrong. Charlie Weasley worked with dragons in Romania, a brother mentioned throughout the books but never seen on screen, existing only in stories and letters. He arranged for Norbert to be smuggled out of Hogwarts, studied dragon behavior in the wild, and came home for important family moments with burn scars on his arms and permanent smell of sulfur in his clothes. During the Triwizard Tournament, he helped transport the dragons for the first task, watching as Harry faced the Hungarian Horntail with a mixture of professional interest and familial concern. Charlie never married, too devoted to his work, too in love with creatures that most wizards feared, living a life the films never acknowledged. His absence from the screen created a hole in the Weasley family dynamic, making them seem smaller than they were, less sprawling and complex. Bill spoke of Charlie with admiration. Mrs. Weasley worried about him with the same anxiety she held for all her children, and his presence in letters reminded readers that the Weasley family extended beyond what we saw, into corners of the magical world where dragons flew, and danger was simply part of the work. Ludo Bagman ran the Department of Magical Games and Sports, a former Quidditch star whose charm hid desperation and corruption that the films never explored. He organized the Triwizard Tournament with bombastic enthusiasm, wearing robes of bright yellow and speaking in the booming voice of someone who'd announced matches to thousands. But Bagman had gambling debts to goblins, bets gone wrong that left him scrambling for money, trying to fix the tournament to pay what he owed. He gave Harry hints during the tasks, not out of kindness, but because he'd bet on Harry to win, and needed that victory to clear his debts. When the goblins finally cornered him, Bagman disappeared, fleeing into hiding while his creditors searched. A cautionary tale about fame fading and desperation taking root. The films replaced him with cleaner storytelling, removing the moral ambiguity and financial corruption, making the tournament seem more innocent than it was. Bagman's empty office at the ministry remained locked, his unpaid debts a reminder that even in the magical world, running from consequences only works for so long. Teddy Lupin was born just before the Battle of Hogwarts, a metamorph magus with his mother's gift and his parents' courage, orphaned within hours of his first breath. Tonks and Remus died fighting Voldemort's forces, leaving their infant son in his grandmother Andromeda's care, creating a cycle of loss that mirrored Harry's own beginning. Harry became Teddy's godfather, a role the films mentioned in passing but never explored, never showed the weight of raising a child whose parents died for the same cause that took Harry's. Teddy grew up changing his hair color with his moods, visiting Harry and Ginny, playing with their children, carrying his parents' legacy without the burden of remembering their faces. The films ended without showing this future, without revealing that Harry would raise someone else through the grief he'd endured, that the cycle of orphaning continued even after Voldemort fell. Teddy's laughter filled Andromeda's house, his hair shifting from blue to green to pink, a small brightness born from immense darkness, proof that life continues even after terrible loss. Professor Binns taught history of magic as a ghost, having died in his sleep one evening and returned to teach the next morning, apparently not noticing his own death. He droned through lectures in a monotonous voice that put students to sleep more effectively than any potion, reading from notes so old they'd turned yellow and brittle. His classroom smelled of dust and old parchment, the windows always slightly fogged, the temperature always slightly too warm for comfort. Binns never appeared in the films, replaced by living professors or eliminated entirely, removing the unique absurdity of a teacher so devoted to his subject that death couldn't stop him. Students passed notes during his classes, dozed against their hands, occasionally woke with start when he mentioned something about goblin rebellions. Hermione was one of the few who actually listened, taking detailed notes while Ron and Harry played games of hangman on spare parchment. The ghost professor represented the extremes of dedication, someone who'd literally worked beyond the grave, his passion for history so consuming that mortality became merely an inconvenience to his teaching schedule. Neville's parents lived in St. Mungo's Hospital, their minds broken by Bellatrix Lestrange's torture, a tragedy the films mentioned but never showed. Frank and Alice Longbottom had been Aurors, brave fighters who'd defied Voldemort 3 times, and when they wouldn't reveal information about their master's whereabouts, Bellatrix used the Cruciatus curse until their minds shattered like glass. They didn't recognize their son when he visited, didn't understand that the boy standing before them was the baby they'd protected. Alice gave Neville bubble gum wrappers, her gift meaningless yet treasured, and Neville's grandmother insisted he not mention these visits to others, treating his parents' condition as a shameful secret rather than a badge of honor. The films reduced this to a single line of exposition, never showing the locked ward where hope died slowly, where decorated heroes spent their days in confusion, unable to remember their own courage. Neville carried his parents' sacrifice quietly, never seeking sympathy, never using their tragedy as excuse, just visiting the hospital and pocketing the wrappers his mother gave him, tiny pieces of paper that meant everything and nothing at all. Dean Thomas and Seamus Finnegan shared a dormitory with Harry. Their friendship and personalities developed far more richly in the books than on screen. Dean had been raised by Muggles, not knowing his father had been a wizard who'd died protecting his family from Death Eaters, a backstory that added depth to his experience at Hogwarts. He dated Ginny briefly, creating tension with Harry that the film simplified into a single jealous glance, missing the complexity of friendship strained by romantic feelings. Seamus had a talent for causing explosions, his attempts at magic frequently going wrong in clouds of smoke and scattered feathers, a running joke that showed how even magical education came with learning curves and failures. The films reduced them to background characters, faces in the common room without distinct voices, erasing the richness of Gryffindor Tower's community. Their beds were covered with Quidditch posters and photographs of family. Their conversations filled the dormitory with laughter and arguments, and their presence reminded readers that Harry's world extended beyond his immediate circle, that Hogwarts was filled with people living their own complete lives. Kreacher muttered insults under his breath constantly, calling Hermione terrible names and complaining about the blood traitor Weasleys who'd invaded his mistress's pure house. He was ancient and angry, loyal to a family that had valued blood purity above all else, serving Sirius only because magic bound him to the black bloodline. When Sirius treated him with contempt, Kreacher's resentment grew poisonous, eventually leading him to betray information to Bellatrix and contributing to Sirius's death at the Department of Mysteries. The films softened Kreacher's character, making him more sympathetic from the start. But the books showed his journey from hateful prejudice to loyalty earned through kindness. When Harry gave him Regulus's locket and spoke with respect, Kreacher transformed, cleaning Grimmauld Place until it shone, cooking elaborate meals, and eventually leading the house-elves of Hogwarts into battle against Death Eaters. His character arc demonstrated how prejudice could be unlearned, how even deeply ingrained hatred could be overcome when someone finally offered dignity instead of contempt. Kreacher's croaking voice echoed through the Black family home, gradually shifting from curses to songs, from poison to something approaching hope. The Marauders' true story emerged gradually through the books, revealing that James Potter and his friends had been talented wizards who'd become illegal animagi to keep Remus Lupin company during his transformations. They'd spent years perfecting the magic, risking Azkaban to help their friend, creating the Marauders' map as a testament to their knowledge of Hogwarts' secrets. Peter Pettigrew had been part of this tight-knit group, not a hanger-on, but a genuine friend, which made his betrayal cut deeper than the films ever showed. James had bullied Severus Snape terribly, using magic to humiliate him in front of crowds, behavior that Lily found unforgivable until James matured and changed. The films showed only fragments of this history, brief glimpses that didn't capture the complexity of friendship, the reality that good people could do cruel things in their youth, that redemption required genuine transformation. The Marauders had nicknames that reflected their animal forms and their bond: Moony, Wormtail, Padfoot, and Prongs, names that carried memories of nights in the Forbidden Forest, of standing beside someone even when the moon made him dangerous, of loyalty that for three of them proved stronger than death itself. Dumbledore's past with Gellert Grindelwald revealed a darkness in the headmaster's youth that the films barely touched. As a young man, brilliant beyond measure, Dumbledore had befriended Grindelwald, and together they'd planned to find the Deathly Hallows, to establish wizard rule over muggles for the greater good, a phrase that would haunt Dumbledore for the rest of his long life. His sister, Ariana, had been attacked by muggle boys, left with unstable magic that eventually killed her in a three-way duel between Dumbledore, his brother Aberforth, and Grindelwald. And Dumbledore never knew which of them had cast the spell that ended her life. This tragedy shaped everything Dumbledore became: his refusal to seek power, his emphasis on love and choice, his understanding that brilliant people could be corrupted by ambition. The films reduced this to brief mentions, never showing the full weight of Dumbledore's guilt, never exploring how his past made him the perfect mentor for Harry, someone who understood exactly how power could corrupt even those with the best intentions. Dumbledore's office held reminders of Ariana, photographs he kept hidden, memories he carried like stones in his pockets, heavy and constant. Snape's childhood in a house where his father drank and his mother wilted explained the bitterness that never quite left him, even when he turned from darkness toward light. He'd grown up in poverty, wearing clothes that didn't fit properly, escaping into magic and dreams of Hogwarts, where everything would be different. But at school, James Potter and Sirius Black had tormented him, using their popularity and talent to make Snape's life miserable, creating a hatred that Snape carried for decades. His love for Lily Potter was genuine and unrequited, a feeling that drove him to protect her son even while resenting Harry's existence, even while seeing James's face every time he looked at the boy. The films showed Snape's memories in a rush, beautiful but incomplete, missing the daily cruelty he'd endured, the way poverty and bullying had shaped him into someone who protected himself with cruelty of his own. Snape's Patronus took the form of a doe, same as Lily's, a silver reminder of love that had never faded, that had lasted beyond death, beyond reason, beyond everything except the promise he'd made to keep her child safe. His double life had required him to be hated by everyone, to be trusted by no one except Dumbledore, to live in shadows so complete that even his death almost went misunderstood. Ginny Weasley's personality in the books shone far brighter than her film portrayal suggested. She'd been possessed by Tom Riddle for an entire year, opening the Chamber of Secrets and releasing the basilisk while having no memory of her actions, experiencing trauma that the films never explored. That experience made her one of the few people who understood what Harry faced, who knew what it felt like to have Voldemort in your mind. She was funny and fierce, talented at Quidditch and skilled with hexes, popular enough to date several boys before Harry finally noticed her as more than Ron's little sister. Her bat bogey hex became legendary. Her confidence grew with each year, and by the time she and Harry finally got together, she'd become someone who could stand beside him as an equal rather than a fan. The films reduced her to shy glances and awkward moments, missing entirely the fire that made her a fitting match for the boy who lived. Ginny flew like she was born on a broomstick, laughed like she owned the sky, and loved Harry without ever making that love the defining feature of her character, remaining completely herself even when her heart belonged to him. Luna Lovegood's depth went far beyond the dreamy exterior the films captured so well. Her mother had died in a magical experiment gone wrong when Luna was 9 years old, a loss that taught her that extraordinary things came with extraordinary risks, that the pursuit of knowledge sometimes demanded terrible prices. She believed in creatures that didn't exist and ideas that seemed ridiculous, but she also saw truth that others missed, understanding Harry's grief and isolation in ways that more conventional friends couldn't. Luna was bullied mercilessly by other Ravenclaws, her belongings stolen and hidden, forced to go barefoot to the Yule Ball because someone had taken her shoes. But she responded to cruelty with a kind of unshakable serenity that came from knowing who she was and refusing to change for anyone. The films showed her quirks but missed her strength. The steel underneath the strange, the way she'd endured torture at Malfoy Manor without breaking, how she'd fought in the Battle of Hogwarts with wand raised and voice steady. Her father published The Quibbler, turning it from a conspiracy magazine into a resistance newspaper when the Daily Prophet fell under ministry control, and Luna helped him print the truth even when truth became dangerous to speak. Draco Malfoy's internal conflict in Half-Blood Prince showed a boy drowning in expectations he couldn't meet, ordered by Voldemort to kill Dumbledore or watch his family die. The films captured some of this struggle, but the books revealed more depth, showing Draco crying in Moaning Myrtle's bathroom, looking thin and ill, unable to sleep while the weight of an impossible task crushed him. He'd grown up believing in pure blood supremacy, taught that Muggles and Muggleborns were inferior, but when faced with actual murder, he couldn't do it, proving that even terrible education couldn't entirely corrupt a conscience. His mother loved him more than she loved Voldemort's cause, lying to the Dark Lord to protect her son, and his father's fall from grace showed Draco what awaited him if he continued down that path. The room of requirement became his prison, the cabinet he repaired his burden, and when the moment came to actually kill, he stood with wand raised and shaking, unable to cross that final line. Draco wasn't redeemed in the books the way some wanted, but he was humanized, shown as someone who'd been raised in poison but retained enough humanity to be horrified when that poison demanded blood. Hagrid's expulsion from Hogwarts in his 3rd year shaped his entire life, leaving him without a proper education but with fierce loyalty to the school that had been his home. He'd been blamed for opening the Chamber of Secrets, accused of raising the monster that killed Moaning Myrtle, when in truth he'd only been raising an acromantula named Aragog in a cupboard. Tom Riddle had framed him, using Hagrid's love of dangerous creatures to deflect suspicion from himself, a cruelty that cost Hagrid his wand and his future. Dumbledore had hired him as gamekeeper, allowing him to stay at Hogwarts, and later made him a professor despite the ministry's objections, recognizing that Hagrid's knowledge of magical creatures outweighed his lack of formal credentials. The films showed Hagrid's warmth, but missed some of his complexity, the shame he carried about his giant blood, the way he drank too much when he was sad, the occasional lapses in judgment that came from someone who'd never properly learned when secrets should be kept. Hagrid's hut smelled of fire and dog and something cooking in a pot, and his heart was so large it sometimes got him in trouble, but his loyalty never wavered, not even when being loyal meant facing down Death Eaters or standing between students and danger. The Sorting Hat sang a different song each year, commenting on current events while explaining house values, a tradition the films reduced to a single song in the first movie. In Harry's 5th year, the Hat warned about division, urging unity in the face of Voldemort's return, sensing the fractures already forming in the school. Each song revealed the Hat's personality, its dry humor and genuine concern, its 1,000 years of wisdom watching students come and go. The Hat had belonged to Gryffindor himself, imbued with the intelligence of all 4 founders, able to see into minds and discern where each student would thrive or be challenged. It had offered to put Harry in Slytherin, sensing his potential for greatness, for ambition, for the parts of him that resembled Tom Riddle, but respecting his choice to refuse. The films never explored this fully, never showed how much the sorting ceremony meant beyond simple house assignment, how it represented the Hat's belief that choice mattered more than inherent traits, that where you chose to stand defined you more than where you might fit best. The Hat sat in Dumbledore's office between sortings, patched and ancient, holding memories of every student it had ever sorted, a repository of Hogwarts history stitched into magical fabric. The Hogwarts kitchens lay directly beneath the Great Hall, staffed by over 100 house-elves who created elaborate feasts from recipes passed down through centuries. Harry visited several times, led by house-elf tunnels, finding a room that mirrored the Great Hall above, complete with 4 long tables where the elves worked. They were delighted to serve students, offering food at any hour, treating Harry like royalty because he'd freed Dobby and treated house elves with respect. The films never showed this location, missing the opportunity to explore how Hogwarts actually functioned, how the magic of house elves made the castle possible, providing meals and cleaning and maintenance that witches and wizards took for granted. Dobby worked in the kitchens after Dumbledore hired him, the only house elf in Britain who received wages, and Winky sat in the corner drinking butterbeer and weeping for the service she'd lost. The air in the kitchens smelled of baking bread and roasting meat, of pumpkin juice and treacle tart, of every comfort food that students dreamed about during exams, created by invisible hands that asked for nothing but the joy of serving well. Hermione studied ancient runes and arithmancy, subjects requiring academic rigor far beyond what the films showed, taking so many classes in 3rd year that she needed a time turner just to attend them all. Ancient runes taught magical alphabets and their properties, symbols that could be carved into objects to give them power or protection. Arithmancy was the magical study of numbers, predicting futures, and analyzing magical properties through complex calculations that made ordinary mathematics seem simple. These subjects didn't advance the plot directly, so the films cut them entirely. But they showed Hermione's intellectual hunger, her desire to learn everything Hogwarts could teach her, preparing herself for a future where knowledge would be power. During the Horcrux hunt, Hermione's preparation saved them repeatedly, her months spent researching in the library giving her the tools they needed to survive without Dumbledore's guidance. She'd copied entire books into her beaded bag, shrinking and organizing information like someone who knew that circumstances might require them to abandon everything except what they could carry. Her cleverness wasn't just puzzle solving, but comprehensive preparation, the kind that only came from someone who took even optional subjects seriously, who treated education not as a game, but as essential preparation for survival in a dangerous world. Fred Weasley's death in the Battle of Hogwarts hit with devastating impact that the films showed but didn't fully explore. He died laughing at something Percy said, a moment of reconciliation and joy destroyed by an explosion. leaving George to face a life without his other half. Fred and George had been a unit since birth, completing each other's sentences, thinking in tandem, building a business that reflected their shared genius for mischief and innovation. The Weasley family buried Fred with grief that didn't heal cleanly, a hole in their family that couldn't be filled or forgotten. George continued the shop, but everyone knew it wasn't the same, that half the laughter had died on that battlefield, that some bonds were so deep their severing left permanent scars. The films showed the moment of death briefly, moving on quickly to other battles, other losses, but the books let that grief sit, acknowledging that 50 people died that night, that each death mattered, that Fred's last laugh would echo forever in his family's memory. The joke shop in Diagon Alley stayed open, selling skiving snack boxes and Peruvian instant darkness powder. But the wizard behind the counter smiled less frequently, and the workshop upstairs stayed half empty, waiting for an inventor who would never return. Dumbledore's funeral drew wizards from around the world, merpeople rising from the Black Lake to pay respects, centaurs emerging from the Forbidden Forest to fire arrows of mourning into the air. The ceremony took place by the lake's edge, Dumbledore's body wrapped in purple velvet and lying in a marble tomb that appeared through Dumbledore's brother's magic. Hagrid carried the body, weeping openly, and even the castle itself seemed to mourn, the windows dark, the usual sounds of student life suspended in respect. The films cut this scene entirely, jumping from Dumbledore's death to the next year, losing the weight of how the wizarding world honored its greatest defender. White flames erupted around the tomb, encasing it in protection, and students stood in silence while teachers wept, while the lake's surface reflected the fire, while everything stopped to acknowledge that something essential had been lost. The funeral represented not just Dumbledore's passing, but the end of an era, the removal of the one person Voldemort had ever feared, leaving the world more vulnerable and the future more uncertain than it had been since Voldemort's first rise to power. The Fidelius charm didn't just hide locations, but removed knowledge of them from everyone except the Secret Keeper, making even seeing the location written down impossible until the Secret Keeper revealed it. When James and Lily chose Peter Pettigrew as their Secret Keeper instead of Sirius, they bet their lives on his loyalty, a gamble that cost them everything. The charm was so powerful that someone could stand outside the hidden location and not see it, could have the address written in their hand and have the words mean nothing, could search for years and never find what stood directly before them. The films simplified this to they were hidden, missing the elegant complexity of the magic, the way it manipulated knowledge itself rather than just visibility. After Voldemort's fall, Grimmauld Place became the Order's headquarters, protected by this same charm with Dumbledore as Secret Keeper, and only those he told could find the building squeezed between number 11 and number 13. The magic rewrote reality itself, not just perception, making the hidden thing truly unknowable rather than simply unseen, a distinction that showed how powerful ancient magic could be when properly executed. Tom Riddle's childhood in a Muggle orphanage shaped the man who would become Voldemort, showing cruelty that began long before Hogwarts. He discovered his powers early, using them to hurt other children, to steal, to manipulate, enjoying the fear he created and feeling no remorse for suffering he caused. When Dumbledore visited to offer him a place at Hogwarts, Tom already understood that he was special, that power set him apart, that magic could be used to dominate and control. The films showed brief glimpses of this past, but the books devoted entire chapters to exploring how Tom became Voldemort, how his inability to understand love came from a mother who'd died and a father who'd abandoned him, how he chose to interpret his circumstances as proof of his superiority rather than reasons for compassion. He'd collected trophies even then, stealing from other orphans, keeping reminders of his victories, a habit that would eventually lead him to create Horcruxes from objects he considered meaningful. Tom's face had been handsome before dark magic twisted it. His charisma real before power made him monstrous, and tracking that transformation showed how evil grew from choices rather than appearing fully formed. The Gaunt family lived in squalor despite their pureblood pride. Marvolo Gaunt treasuring a ring bearing the Peveril coat of arms and a locket that had belonged to Slytherin himself. His daughter Merop loved a muggle named Tom Riddle, using magic to make him stay with her, bearing his child before the enchantment wore off and he fled in disgust. The films reduced this to brief exposition, but the books showed the tragedy of Merop's life, how she'd been abused by her father and brother, how she'd chosen to use magic to bind someone to her rather than earn love honestly, how she'd died giving birth to Tom, choosing death over a life without magic or love. The Gaunt shack smelled of rot and neglect, its walls covered in grime, its floors thick with dirt, proof that magical blood meant nothing without dignity or care. Marvolo had gone to Azkaban for attacking ministry officials. His son Morphin had followed, and the line had died in poverty and madness, their precious bloodline ending in a shack where snakes nested in the corners and the air tasted of desperation. Tom Riddle inherited their pride without their circumstances, their belief in supremacy without their powerlessness, taking the worst of their legacy and building an empire on foundations of hatred and fear. Sirius Black's childhood in Grimmauld Place had been suffocating, his family devoted to pureblood supremacy and dark arts, his mother's portrait still screaming from the wall decades after her death. He'd been sorted into Gryffindor instead of Slytherin, a betrayal his family never forgave, finding refuge with James Potter's family who'd treated him like a second son. Running away at 16 had meant losing his inheritance but gaining his freedom, choosing poverty with people who loved him over wealth, with people who demanded he become someone he despised. The films showed Sirius as mysterious and damaged, but missed the full weight of his story. How 12 years in Azkaban had nearly broken him, how he'd survived by knowing he was innocent and transforming into a dog to keep the Dementors partially at bay. His relationship with Harry was complicated, seeing James in Harry's face, wanting to be the godfather he'd never had a chance to be, sometimes forgetting that Harry wasn't James and needed different things. Sirius died falling through a veil in the Department of Mysteries, a death so sudden it barely seemed real, and Harry's grief manifested in denial and rage because losing Sirius meant losing the only family who'd wanted him, who'd chosen him, who'd represented a future where Harry could finally belong somewhere unconditionally. The prophecy spoken by Sybil Trelawney stated that either Harry or Voldemort must die at the other's hand, that neither could live while the other survived, words that shaped Harry's entire existence. But Dumbledore emphasized that the prophecy only mattered because Voldemort chose to believe it, that he could have ignored it entirely, and Harry would have remained just another student. That choice gave the prophecy power rather than the prophecy determining choice. The films showed the prophecy's destruction but didn't explore this crucial distinction, missing Dumbledore's teaching about free will and self-determination. Voldemort had heard only half the prophecy, learning enough to fear it but not enough to understand it, and his attempt to prevent it had created the very circumstances that made it come true. The full prophecy sat in the Hall of Prophecies for years, glowing softly, its glass sphere containing words that would either mean nothing or everything, depending on whether the people involved chose to believe. Harry carried the burden of knowing he must be either murderer or victim, that his destiny involved death one way or another, but also the knowledge that Voldemort's choices had made this prophecy matter, that without those choices, the words would have been meaningless smoke. The tale of three brothers appeared in The Tales of Beedle the Bard, a story Hermione received in Dumbledore's will, leading them to understand the Deathly Hallows. Three brothers encountered death himself and received gifts: the Elder Wand for the eldest who sought power, the Resurrection Stone for the middle brother who sought to reverse death, and the Invisibility Cloak for the youngest who sought to hide from death. The eldest was murdered for his wand. The middle brother killed himself after the stone brought back only a shadow of his lost love. And the youngest lived a long life before greeting death as an old friend. The films animated this tale beautifully, but didn't fully explore how it paralleled the Deathly Hallows quest, how Dumbledore had been like the eldest brother seeking the wand, how Snape resembled the middle brother unable to let go of loss, how Harry became the youngest brother who accepted death and therefore mastered it. The story taught that true power came from accepting mortality rather than fighting it, that the greatest magic was knowing when to let go, that death could only be defeated by making peace with it rather than seeking to escape or control it. Lily Potter's sacrifice created ancient magic through willing death for love, protection that Voldemort never understood because he'd never loved, making Harry marked by power the Dark Lord knew not. When Voldemort killed Lily, her love became a shield burned into Harry's skin and blood, so powerful that Voldemort couldn't touch him without experiencing terrible pain. This protection extended to wherever Harry called home, which is why Dumbledore insisted he return to the Dursleys each summer, maintaining the blood bond through Petunia that kept Harry safe. The films explained this, but didn't emphasize how extraordinary it was, how Lily's choice to die rather than step aside created magic that even the greatest dark wizard couldn't overcome. Voldemort had given Lily the chance to live, had told her to move, had offered mercy because Snape had begged him to spare her, but she'd refused, choosing death to give Harry any chance at survival. That choice, freely made with full understanding of consequences, activated magic so old and powerful that it couldn't be undone or circumvented, proving that love wielded intentionally could be the strongest magic in existence. Neville Longbottom's growth from frightened first year to the student who killed Nagini and led resistance against the Carrows happened gradually through the books, each small act of courage building toward his final transformation. He'd been clumsy and forgetful, his grandmother constantly disappointed, his self-esteem crushed by years of being told he wasn't good enough. But Neville had stood up to his friends in first year, had fought at the Department of Mysteries despite his terror, had continued Dumbledore's army when Harry left, turning it from study group to active resistance. The films showed his final moments of glory, but missed the journey, the way Neville learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but action despite it, that being brave when you were terrified counted more than heroics that came easily. He'd pulled Gryffindor's sword from the sorting hat through sheer worthiness, decapitating the last Horcrux while Voldemort watched, a moment that proved Neville had become exactly what his parents would have wanted. someone who fought for what was right even when fighting seemed hopeless. His face bore scars from the Carrow's torture. His body carried wounds from leading student rebellion. But his eyes held certainty that he'd finally found himself, that he'd become brave not because he stopped being afraid, but because he'd learned that some things mattered more than fear. Ron Weasley's character had depths the films reduced to comic relief and jealousy, missing his strategic mind and fierce loyalty. He'd beaten McGonagall's giant chess set in first year, making himself the sacrifice to let Harry continue, understanding immediately what needed to be done, and doing it without hesitation. His insecurities about being poor, about being overshadowed by brilliant friends and accomplished siblings, manifested as jealousy and anger. But he always came back, always chose friendship over pride. The locket Horcrux had fed on his fears, showing him visions of Harry and Hermione together, playing on his deepest insecurity. And when he'd destroyed it, he'd proven those fears were lies he didn't have to believe. Ron made Harry laugh when everything was dark, provided connections to wizard culture Harry didn't have, offered fierce protection even when he was frightened. The films made him primarily comic, missing his insights and his growth, the way he learned that he didn't need to be the smartest or the chosen one to matter, that being loyal and brave and present counted more than any prophecy. Ron's relationship with Hermione built over 7 years through arguments and jealousy and unwavering partnership. Their kiss during the Battle of Hogwarts earned by years of emotional growth and learning to see each other clearly. The Weasley twins' joke shop in Diagon Alley became a symbol of resistance during Voldemort's regime, providing laughter when the world grew dark, selling Defense Against the Dark Arts items disguised as toys. Fred and George had developed their products for years, starting in their bedroom, testing on students, perfecting the magic that made skiving snack boxes and portable swamps possible. Their Peruvian instant darkness powder had helped Harry escape Umbridge. Their decoy detonators helped the Order, and their shop became a bright spot in an increasingly dangerous world. The films showed the shop briefly, but didn't capture how the twins had turned mischief into meaningful resistance, how humor became a weapon against fear, how their insistence on joy was itself an act of defiance. They'd left Hogwarts in spectacular fashion during Umbridge's reign, setting off fireworks that turned into dragons and rockets, creating chaos that the entire school celebrated, proving that some rules deserved to be broken and some authority didn't deserve respect. Their laughter echoed through their shop. Their identical grins invited customers into a world where magic was playful rather than dangerous. And their success showed that not everyone needed to fight with wands to fight against darkness. Tonks and Remus Lupin's relationship showed love complicated by self-loathing and societal prejudice, a romance the films simplified into brief scenes. Remus initially rejected Tonks because he was a werewolf, because he was poor and damaged and too old for her, because society taught him he was unworthy of love. Tonks pursued him anyway, her Patronus changing to match his wolf form, her hair losing its usual brightness when he pushed her away, her entire being dimmed by his rejection. When they finally married, Remus panicked, tried to abandon her when she became pregnant, afraid of passing lycanthropy to his child, afraid of being a father when he felt he'd barely survived being a person. Harry's anger at this cowardice shocked Remus into returning, into choosing to be present rather than running from fear, into accepting that love required staying even when staying was terrifying. They died together in the Battle of Hogwarts, leaving Teddy orphaned, a tragedy that showed how war took the good alongside the bad, how rebuilding required mourning what was lost even while celebrating victory. Tonks's hair had been pink with joy when she married Remus, and perhaps it was pink again when she died, knowing her son would be loved, and her husband had finally learned that he deserved happiness. Dobby's freedom became his defining characteristic, making him unique among house-elves who found liberation disturbing rather than desirable. He'd served the Malfoy family for generations, enduring abuse and treating it as normal until he encountered Harry Potter and discovered that wizards could be kind. When Harry tricked Lucius Malfoy into freeing Dobby with a sock hidden in Tom Riddle's diary, Dobby gained something most house-elves feared: autonomy. He struggled with freedom initially, wearing mismatched socks and odd hats, trying to pay himself wages, eventually finding employment at Hogwarts, where Dumbledore let him negotiate his own terms. The films showed Dobby's devotion to Harry, but reduced his presence to 2 movies, missing years of development, missing how Dobby's freedom became his greatest strength. He refused to let Harry return to Hogwarts when he thought Harry was in danger. He fought Kreacher to protect Harry's secrets, and finally, he died, saving Harry and his friends from Malfoy Manor. His last words: Harry Potter. The grave Harry dug for Dobby at Shell Cottage was carved without magic. Every shovelful of earth moved by hand, a labor of grief and respect that showed how much a free elf's loyalty meant when it was given rather than compelled. The Department of Mysteries employed unspeakables who studied time, death, love, and prophecy in complete secrecy, their work so classified that even their families didn't know their assignments. Behind locked doors sat rooms filled with mysteries, a chamber where time itself could be manipulated, glass spheres containing prophecies about futures that might or might not come true, a locked room that Dumbledore said contained a force more powerful than death or time or human intelligence. The films showed the Hall of Prophecies and the Veil, but didn't explore the other mysteries, didn't show the room full of time-turners destroyed in the battle, didn't reveal the depth of magical research happening beneath the Ministry. The Veil stood in a chamber of tiered stone seats, a gateway to death that whispered to those who'd lost people, that called to Harry with voices of those he'd loved and lost. Luna could hear the voices too, having watched her mother die, and the film captured her quiet statement, "I can hear them too," but didn't explore how the Veil represented mysteries that magic couldn't solve, questions that remained unanswered, even by those who devoted their lives to studying them. Some knowledge remained forever beyond reach, some doors stayed locked even to unspeakables, and some mysteries were meant to stay mysterious. Gamp's law of elemental transfiguration stated that food couldn't be conjured from nothing, explaining why wizards still needed to grow or buy ingredients even with magic at their disposal. Hermione cited this law during the Horcrux hunt, explaining why they couldn't simply create feasts when they were hungry, why she'd spent months preparing supplies. The films never mentioned this limitation, allowing magic to seem more powerful and convenient than the books suggested. These kinds of rules grounded the magical world, made it feel like it operated on consistent principles rather than pure imagination, created boundaries that made magical achievement meaningful. Wizards could multiply food that already existed, could summon it from other locations, could transform it from one type to another, but creation from nothing violated fundamental magical law. This explained why Hogwarts needed house-elves to cook, why Molly Weasley spent time in her kitchen, why magical communities still had economies based on agriculture and production. The law represented how even in a world of magic, some rules couldn't be broken, some limitations persisted, and power had boundaries that couldn't be wished away no matter how desperately someone might want to transcend them. The unbreakable vow bound wizards through magic that killed those who broke their word, a spell so serious that its use was rare and desperate. Snape made an unbreakable vow to Narcissa Malfoy, promising to protect Draco, to help him complete his task, and to finish the job if Draco failed, essentially vowing to murder Dumbledore or die trying. The films showed this scene but didn't emphasize how binding the vow was, how it represented Snape's commitment to his role as double agent taken to its ultimate conclusion. Bellatrix witnessed the vow, her presence ensuring Snape couldn't refuse without revealing his true loyalties, trapping him into a promise that would require him to kill the only person who knew he was good. The magic wound around their joined hands like glowing rope, binding them together, making betrayal literally impossible. This vow explained why Snape had to kill Dumbledore, why he couldn't simply refuse or run, why that moment on the tower was inevitable from the moment he'd made the promise. It also showed Snape's absolute commitment to his role, his willingness to risk his soul by committing murder to maintain his position close to Voldemort, his understanding that some sacrifices were necessary even when they destroyed everything he'd worked to become. Grindelwald's defeat by Dumbledore in 1945 had been legendary throughout the wizarding world, a duel between two brilliant wizards who'd once been friends and perhaps more. Dumbledore had acquired the Elder Wand through this victory, becoming master of a weapon he never wanted, keeping it only because allowing it to fall into other hands seemed more dangerous than holding it himself. The films showed Grindelwald briefly as a prisoner in his own fortress, but the books revealed that he'd felt remorse for his crimes, that he'd lied to Voldemort about the wand's location to prevent it being taken from Dumbledore's tomb, that even dark wizards could eventually regret the paths they'd chosen. Grindelwald had killed and conquered for the greater good, believing wizard rule would benefit everyone, that the ends justified terrible means, a philosophy Dumbledore had once shared before his sister's death, taught him that power wielded even with good intentions could corrupt. The duel between them had decided more than personal supremacy. It had determined whether the wizarding world would remain hidden or reveal itself to Muggles, whether fear or tolerance would prevail, whether two brilliant people could find different answers to the same questions about power and responsibility. Petunia Dursley had once wanted to attend Hogwarts, writing to Dumbledore begging for admission despite being a Muggle, receiving a kind rejection that shaped her resentment toward magic. She'd watched her sister receive everything she'd wanted, had seen Lily transform from ordinary girl into someone special, had felt left behind in a way that festered into bitterness. Her treatment of Harry came partly from Vernon's influence, but also from her own remembered jealousy, from resenting that Harry represented the magical world that had rejected her. The films portrayed Petunia as purely cruel, but the books showed complexity, showing how she'd protected Harry because Lily had been her sister, how she'd maintained the blood protection even while resenting its necessity. Her knowledge of magic was deeper than she pretended, having absorbed information through years of living with Lily, and occasionally she revealed that knowledge in moments of stress or anger. Petunia's final departure from Privet Drive included a moment where she almost said something to Harry, almost acknowledged their connection, but couldn't quite break through decades of resentment to offer the kindness that might have changed everything. She'd lived her entire life feeling ordinary in the worst way, envying magic she could never have, protecting a nephew she couldn't bring herself to love, trapped in choices she'd made so long ago, she'd forgotten they were choices at all. The Quibbler transformed from conspiracy tabloid to resistance newspaper when the Daily Prophet fell under ministry control, printing truth when truth became dangerous. Luna's father, Xenophilius Lovegood, edited the magazine, publishing wild theories about creatures that didn't exist alongside genuine news the Prophet refused to print. When Harry gave an interview about Voldemort's return, the Quibbler printed it in full, creating the only public platform where truth could be spoken without ministry censorship. The magazine's circulation exploded as people sought information they knew was being suppressed, and what had been a joke became essential reading. The films never showed this transformation, missing how humor and seemingly foolish persistence could become weapons against authoritarianism, how Luna's father's refusal to be silenced mattered when silence was enforced everywhere else. The Quibbler's offices were messy and chaotic, filled with Luna's father's research into impossible creatures and ancient relics. But during Voldemort's reign, they became a beacon, proof that some people would keep printing truth even when truth carried consequences. Xenophilius's eventual betrayal of Harry came from desperation to save Luna, showing how even resistance could be broken by threatening what people loved most. How bravery had limits when Death Eaters held your child hostage. The room of requirement changed based on what the seeker needed, becoming whatever space was required at that moment, appearing only to those who truly needed it. Dumbledore had once joked about finding it full of chamber pots, and Harry had discovered it when desperately needing a place to hide something, finding a vast warehouse of objects hidden over centuries. The room became the DA's practice space, transformed into a perfect classroom with shelves of Defense Against the Dark Arts books and dummies for practicing spells. Later, it became Draco's workshop where he repaired the vanishing cabinet, and finally, it became a refuge for students fleeing the Carrow's cruelty. The films showed the room but didn't capture its versatility, how it responded to intention. Rather than just appearing when asked, how it could be different things simultaneously for different people if their needs didn't conflict. The room held memories of everyone who'd ever used it, layers of purpose built up over 1,000 years, and when fire consumed it during the final battle, centuries of hidden things burned together, secrets and treasures destroyed indiscriminately. The room's magic overwhelmed by fiend fire that couldn't be controlled or contained. Harry had saved Draco from that fire despite everything, pulling him onto a broomstick while flames roared and the room collapsed into itself, proving that some choices transcended old grudges when life hung in the balance. The Sacred 28 were pure-blood families listed in a directory published in the 1930s, creating an aristocracy that excluded even ancient families like the Potters because they were considered tainted by Muggle sympathy. The list included the Blacks, Malfoys, Lestranges, and Weasleys, though the Weasleys were considered blood traitors for their acceptance of Muggles and Muggleborns. This artificial hierarchy shaped wizarding society for generations, determining who received respect and who faced prejudice, creating divisions that Voldemort exploited when building his movement. The films never mentioned the Sacred 28, missing how deeply blood purity ideology had been codified into social structures, how prejudice operated through seemingly legitimate categorization. Families intermarried to keep bloodlines pure, creating a small, inbred community where everyone was related somehow, where genetic diversity diminished with each generation. The obsession with purity had weakened these families magically and morally, producing brilliant wizards alongside squibs and madness, proving that blood purity was a fiction that harmed those who believed in it most. The directory sat in old wizarding libraries, its pages yellowed, its categories treated as fact by some and rejected as nonsense by others, a symbol of how easily hatred could dress itself in scholarship and respectability. St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries occupied a building in London disguised as a condemned department store. Healers treating everything from dragonpox to spell damage to curses that defied conventional curing. Harry visited in his 5th year, seeing the permanent spell damage ward where Neville's parents lived, where Gilderoy Lockhart remained after his memory charm backfired, where people existed in states that magic couldn't fix. The ward smelled of cleaning potions and sadness, its patients wandering in confusion or sitting in silence, their families visiting with smiles that didn't reach their eyes. The films reduced St. Mungo's to a brief mention, never showing the hospital that saved Arthur Weasley's life after Nagini's attack, never exploring how magical medicine worked or what happened to wizards whose injuries transcended healing. Alice Longbottom gave Neville gum wrappers during visits, her mind so fractured she didn't recognize her own son. And Frank stared at nothing, both of them lost inside themselves while their bodies remained. The healers wore lime green robes and moved efficiently through wards, treating injuries from potions accidents and magical mishaps, performing medicine that blended magic with care, proving that even in a world of spells, some damage required time and patience rather than instant solutions. Hogsmeade stood as the only entirely magical village in Britain, its streets lined with shops that served Hogwarts students and wizarding families who valued living among their own kind. Honeydukes sold sweets that fizzed and popped and changed color. Zonkos provided joke items. The Three Broomsticks served butterbeer in a warm pub where everyone knew everyone else. The Shrieking Shack earned its reputation as the most haunted building in Britain through sounds that were actually Remus Lupin's transformations. The Whomping Willow planted to hide the tunnel leading there, creating the safe space where a werewolf could rage without hurting anyone. The films showed Hogsmeade briefly, reducing it to background rather than exploring how it functioned as community, how Madame Rosmerta knew her customers by name, how the village represented what wizarding culture looked like when it didn't have to hide. Students visited on weekends, drinking butterbeer and shopping and feeling temporarily adult, the village offering a taste of freedom before returning to school. In winter, Hogsmeade's streets filled with snow that never became dirty slush, enchanted to remain pristine, and lights glowed from windows where families celebrated wizarding holidays that Muggles never witnessed. A complete world existing alongside the mundane one that most people never suspected. Privet Drive represented the Muggle world's worst qualities through the Dursleys, showing how ordinary prejudice could be just as harmful as magical dark arts. Vernon and Petunia had tried to stamp the magic out of Harry, treating him as a shameful secret, making him sleep in a cupboard and wear Dudley's old clothes and believe he was worthless. Dudley had been encouraged to bully Harry, raised to believe his cousin deserved contempt, growing into a spoiled child whose parents denied him nothing except moral education. The films showed the Dursleys' cruelty but softened it, missing the years of systematic emotional abuse, the way they'd starved Harry while Dudley grew obese, the casual violence of Vernon grabbing Harry by the throat. But even the Dursleys showed capacity for change. Dudley's encounter with Dementors had forced him to see himself clearly, leading to awkward attempts at reconciliation, to the moment when he told Harry, "You're not waste of space." That single sentence, grudging and uncomfortable, represented enormous growth for someone raised to see Harry as subhuman. Proof that even people shaped by prejudice could recognize their own cruelty and try, however clumsily, to be better. Privet Drive's perfect lawns and identical houses represented conformity, enforced through fear of difference, and Harry's survival there before escaping to Hogwarts each year showed his resilience, his ability to endure without becoming cruel himself. The burrow stood crooked and chaotic, held together by magic and love rather than architectural soundness. Every room added haphazardly as the Weasley family grew. Ghoul lived in the attic. Gnomes infested the garden. Chickens wandered freely, and the whole structure leaned at angles that should have been impossible. The kitchen smelled of Mrs. Weasley's cooking, always something simmering on the stove, always enough food despite limited money. Her magic making meals stretched to feed however many children had come home. The family clock had hands for each member showing their location and status, and during the war every hand pointed to mortal peril constantly, a reminder that danger had become their permanent condition. The films showed the burrow but couldn't capture its warmth, how it represented everything the Dursleys' house wasn't, how Harry felt more at home in its chaos than he'd ever felt in Privet Drive's sterile order. Fred and George's room overflowed with joke products in development. Ron's room held Chudley Cannon's posters. Ginny's room stayed mostly private, and everywhere photographs moved and laughed and waved, making the walls feel alive. When Death Eaters burned the burrow in the films, it was a scene invented for drama, never happening in books where the burrow survived the war, standing as testament to the idea that love built stronger foundations than hatred ever could. Platform 9 3/4 existed between the mundane and magical worlds, requiring faith to walk through a solid barrier and emerge where the Hogwarts Express waited. Muggles walked past the barrier constantly without seeing it, the magic hiding the platform from those who didn't believe, creating a threshold that separated ordinary life from extraordinary education. The films showed the platform beautifully, capturing the steam and excitement, but didn't emphasize how it represented the choice to enter the magical world, how students had to commit to walking through solid stone, trusting that magic would hold. Parents said goodbye there each September, watching children disappear into a world they might not fully understand, trusting Hogwarts to keep them safe and teach them well. The Hogwarts Express itself was ancient, its scarlet engine gleaming, its compartments filled with students sharing sweets and gossip. The journey north taking hours while the Scottish landscape rolled past windows. Harry's first trip to Hogwarts had changed his entire life, meeting Ron in a compartment filled with pumpkin pasties and chocolate frogs, learning that the wizarding world contained kindness and friendship as well as magic. The platform represented possibility, the moment between who you were and who you might become. The step that required courage even though it looked like simply walking forward. Quidditch operated on complex rules, the films simplified into visual spectacle, missing the strategy and tradition that made it the wizarding world's most popular sport. 7 players per team flew on broomsticks, chasers scoring with the quaffle while beaters used bludgers to disrupt opponents, and the keeper defended the goals. The seeker caught the golden snitch to end the game, earning 150 points, but that didn't guarantee victory if the other team had built sufficient lead. The films focused on Harry's seeker role, showing spectacular catches but rarely explaining how Quidditch functioned as sport rather than just magical entertainment. Each position required different skills, different broom handling, different tactical thinking. Professional teams had dedicated followers. The World Cup drew wizards from around the globe, and players became celebrities whose every match was analyzed and debated. Ron worshipped the Chudley Cannons despite their constant losses. Ginny played chaser with aggressive brilliance, and the Weasley twins had been beaters who used bludgers as much for humor as for strategy. The sound of quaffle through hoop, the whistle of bludgers past ears, the roar of crowds when the snitch was sighted, all created atmosphere that made Quidditch feel real, a sport with history and passion rather than just magical flying. The Triwizard Tournament's history stretched back centuries, designed to foster international magical cooperation, but discontinued after too many student deaths made it unsustainable. Its revival in Harry's 4th year was supposed to be safer. Age restrictions and careful task design meant to prevent tragedy. But Barty Crouch Jr.'s manipulation ensured Harry's participation and Cedric's death anyway. The films showed 3 tasks dramatically, but compressed the year-long tournament into highlights, missing how each school's culture influenced their champions, how Beauxbatons students were elegant and Durmstrang students were stern, how the tournament created tensions and alliances that played out over months. The Yule Ball required dress robes and dancing, creating social pressure that rivaled the tournament's physical dangers. And Harry's disaster of asking Cho Chang only after she'd accepted Cedric showed how teenage awkwardness persisted even in magical contexts. The Goblet of Fire itself was an ancient artifact that selected champions through magic older than anyone could remember, binding them to compete once chosen, creating magical contract that couldn't be broken even when the selection was fraudulent. Cedric's body returning from the maze, Harry holding it and screaming that Voldemort had returned, represented how even carefully planned safety could fail when evil was determined enough. The pensieve allowed wizards to store and review memories, extracting silvery strands of thought and placing them in a basin where they could be entered and experienced as though present during the original moment. Dumbledore kept a pensieve in his office, using it to analyze Voldemort's past, to preserve important memories in their purest form, to share knowledge with Harry that couldn't be conveyed through simple telling. The films used the pensieve beautifully, creating visual sequences that showed backstory, but didn't explore how memory magic worked, how memories could be modified, or how the pensieve preserved them against alteration. When Harry entered Snape's memories, he saw moments Snape would never have shared willingly, learning truths that explained everything while devastating his understanding of the man he'd hated for years. Memories in the pensieve, played out with cinematic clarity, the viewer invisible, unable to change anything but able to witness without the distortion that time and emotion usually create. Dumbledore's collection of memories about Tom Riddle painted a portrait of gradual corruption, showing how Voldemort had become through choices and circumstances that might have led someone else toward different outcomes. The pensieve represented the idea that truth could be preserved, that the past could be revisited exactly as it happened, that understanding required seeing events without the bias that participants bring to their own recollections. Polyjuice Potion allowed wizards to assume another person's appearance for an hour, requiring a piece of the person being impersonated and a month to brew properly. Hermione had made it in 2nd year using a bathroom as laboratory, transforming Harry and Ron into Crabbe and Goyle to investigate Draco, accidentally becoming part cat when she used Millicent Bulstrode's hair from a cat. Barty Crouch Jr. had used it constantly throughout 4th year to impersonate Mad-Eye Moody, keeping the real Moody imprisoned while teaching defense against the dark arts and manipulating the Triwizard Tournament. The potion tasted terrible, bubbled thick and muddy, and using it required committing to deception that could be maintained only through constant vigilance and periodic redosing. The films showed polyjuice transformations but didn't emphasize how difficult the potion was to brew, how rare its use was, how it represented magic that required both skill and determination. When the trio used it to infiltrate the ministry, they'd practice their target's mannerisms for weeks, understanding that looking like someone required becoming them convincingly enough that colleagues wouldn't notice discrepancies. The potion symbolized how appearance and identity could be separated, how surface could be manipulated while essence remained, how even magic that changed everything visible couldn't alter who someone truly was underneath. Azkaban prison sat on an island in the North Sea, guarded by dementors who fed on prisoners, happiness until only despair remained, a punishment considered by many to be worse than death. Wizards sent there emerged broken if they emerged at all, their minds damaged by years of forced remembering of their worst moments, their magic weakened by sustained exposure to creatures that drained all hope. Sirius had survived through knowing he was innocent and transforming into a dog, his animal mind simple enough that dementors affected him less. But most prisoners had no such defense. The ministry's use of dementors as guards showed moral compromise, employing creatures of pure evil to punish criminals, creating a system where even guilty prisoners suffered beyond what justice required. When Voldemort returned, many Death Eaters were freed from Azkaban in a mass breakout, showing how the prison that was supposed to be escape-proof failed when guards sympathized with inmates. The films showed Azkaban briefly, dark towers rising from ocean, but couldn't convey the psychological torture of Dementor exposure, how it felt to have every happy memory systematically destroyed until only darkness remained. Kingsley Shacklebolt later reformed the prison system, removing Dementors and creating more humane conditions, recognizing that a society judged by how it treated even its worst members, that justice required punishment without torture, that cruelty in service of law remained cruelty regardless of intention. The Marauders map showed every person in Hogwarts as a labeled dot moving through corridors and secret passages, created by James, Sirius, Remus, and Peter during their school years using knowledge gained through illegal animagus transformation. The map insulted Snape when he tried to read it, programmed by its creators to mock someone they'd tormented as students, showing how even brilliant magic could be petty. Fred and George had stolen it from Filch's office in their first year, using it for 7 years of mischief before gifting it to Harry, passing down a legacy of rule-breaking and navigation. The films showed the map's function, but not its personality, how it responded to those who opened it, how it required the phrase, "I solemnly swear that I am up to no good," to activate, and mischief managed to clear. The map had shown Peter Pettigrew's name when he was disguised as Scabbers, proof that Ron had been sleeping next to a Death Eater for years, a detail Sirius noticed immediately upon seeing the map. The magic required to create it had been extraordinary, requiring knowledge of Hogwarts that took years to accumulate. Charm work sophisticated enough to track every person in a constantly changing castle, and dedication to mischief that defined the Marauders' friendship. The map represented how knowledge could be used for humor rather than harm, how brilliance could serve joy instead of power, how friendship created things that lasted long after the friends themselves were gone. Patronuses took forms that revealed deep aspects of their casters' characters, incorporeal shields against dementors that could become corporeal animals representing the soul's truest nature. Harry's stag matched his father's animagus form. Hermione's otter reflected her playful intelligence. Ron's Jack Russell Terrier showed loyalty, and Luna's hair suggested gentle wildness. Snape's Patronus, being a doe identical to Lily's, proved his love had never faded. That some feelings persisted unchanged across decades, that his protection of Harry came from genuine devotion rather than duty. The films showed Patronuses beautifully, silvery animals of light driving back darkness, but didn't explore how rare corporeal Patronuses were, how many adult wizards couldn't produce them, how Harry, teaching Dumbledore's army this advanced magic at 15, demonstrated his unusual talent. The spell required focusing on the happiest memory possible while saying expecto patronum, channeling joy against creatures that fed on despair, fighting darkness with preserved light. When Harry saw a Patronus across the lake and believed it was his father, only to realize he'd cast it himself, it represented a moment of understanding that he carried his parents' strength within him, that he'd become the protector he'd always needed, that the help he sought had been his own power all along. Dumbledore's army formed in secret during Umbridge's regime, students teaching themselves defense against the dark arts when the Ministry refused to prepare them for war. The group met in the Room of Requirement, practicing spells that Umbridge had banned, learning to fight because they understood that Voldemort's return meant they needed skills more than theoretical knowledge. Harry taught them despite his discomfort with leadership, showing them the Patronus charm and stunning spells and disarming techniques. The films showed montages of practice but missed how DA became community, how students from different houses united around shared purpose, how Neville gained confidence through finally succeeding at magic, how Luna found belonging among people who didn't mock her. They'd signed a parchment agreeing to secrecy, and when Marietta Edgecombe betrayed them, Hermione's curse left "sneak" written across her face in pimples, a reminder that betrayal carried permanent consequences. The DA coins Hermione created allowed Harry to communicate meeting times, warming in members' pockets when messages were sent, showing her practical brilliance. When Umbridge discovered them, the DA scattered but remained connected, reforming the next year under Neville's leadership when Harry left to hunt Horcruxes. The organization represented students refusing to be passive victims, choosing to prepare themselves when authorities failed them, understanding that survival required action rather than hoping someone else would provide protection. Grimmauld Place at number 12 became the Order of the Phoenix's headquarters, a dark townhouse filled with black family, artifacts celebrating pure blood supremacy and dark arts. The house-elf heads mounted on the wall, the umbrella stand made from a troll's leg, and Sirius's mother's portrait that screamed insults all testified to the black family's values, creating an oppressive atmosphere that Sirius had escaped in youth but was forced to return to in hiding. The Order met there to plan resistance against Voldemort, their discussions happening in a dining room where silver serpents decorated the ceiling and the walls seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Kreacher haunted the house, muttering complaints, torn between his loyalty to the black family's ideology and his magical binding to serve Sirius. The films showed Grimmauld Place briefly, but couldn't convey how it felt to occupy a space that celebrated everything they fought against, how the house itself seemed hostile to the Order's presence. When Sirius died, the house passed to Harry, who'd never wanted it, an inheritance that was burden rather than gift. The house stood protected by Fidelius' charm, invisible to those who hadn't been told its location, hidden on a London street where muggles passed by without ever suspecting that magic and resistance existed, squeezed between mundane buildings, planning the war that would determine both worlds' futures. Bill Weasley worked as a curse-breaker for Gringotts in Egypt before returning to England to join the Order, arriving with long hair, a fang earring, and stories of breaking into ancient tombs protected by magic older than Hogwarts. He'd been head boy and had received more OWLs than any Weasley before him, brilliant in ways that made even Percy jealous. His relationship with Fleur Delacour scandalized Mrs. Weasley, who'd thought the French girl was too pretty and too vain. But Fleur proved her depth when Fenrir Greyback savaged Bill during the battle where Dumbledore died. Bill's face was scarred permanently, the werewolf attack leaving him disfigured, though not transformed since Greyback had been in human form. And Fleur's instant response was to declare she was beautiful enough for both of them. Their wedding in the summer before the final book became a moment of joy interrupted by news that the Ministry had fallen. Death Eaters attacking the reception, the celebration transformed instantly into battle. The films reduced Bill to a minor character who appeared briefly, missing his importance as the eldest Weasley brother, his relationship with Fleur, his work helping Harry break into Gringotts. Bill and Fleur's cottage, Shell Cottage, became a refuge for Harry and his friends after escaping Malfoy Manor, a place where they could heal and plan, where Dobby was buried in the garden, where the sound of waves provided backdrop to grief and determination. Fleur Delacour competed in the Triwizard Tournament representing Beauxbaton, her Vila heritage giving her silver blonde hair and an ability to entrance people that made social interaction complicated. Many dismissed her as just pretty, including Hermione initially, but Fleur was talented and fierce, succeeding in tasks that required courage and magical skill. Her sister Gabrielle had been taken as hostage during the second task, and Fleur's panic when she couldn't reach her showed the depth beneath her composed exterior. The films reduced Fleur to background character, even removing her from the final task entirely, missing how she'd fought alongside everyone else, how she'd earned respect through capability rather than appearance. Her relationship with Bill developed after the tournament when she came to England to improve her English and took a job at Gringotts, finding in Bill someone who saw past surface to person. Molly Weasley's initial disapproval came from protective maternal instinct, combined with bias against Fleur's beauty. Assuming someone so attractive couldn't be genuinely good, but Fleur's reaction to Bill's scarring proved her character definitively. At their wedding, Fleur wore white with flowers in her hair, radiating happiness despite the war, choosing to celebrate love even when darkness threatened, proving that joy could be a defiant act in times of fear. The Burrow's garden gnomes were pests that infested the vegetable patch, requiring periodic denoming where you grabbed them and threw them over the hedge, an activity that was somehow both chore and entertainment. The gnomes bit and scratched, called insults in gravelly voices, and returned as soon as you turned your back, making them a permanent feature of Weasley family life. Fred and George had once experimented with kicking gnomes like footballs, seeing how far they could launch the protesting creatures, until Mrs. Weasley caught them and assigned extra denoming as punishment. The films never showed gnomes, missing a detail that grounded the magical world in ordinary frustrations, showing that even wizards dealt with pests and yard work, that magic didn't eliminate life's small annoyances. The garden also held a ghoul in the attic that banged on pipes, chickens that wandered freely, and vegetables that grew to enormous sizes through magic-aided gardening. During the war, when Ron was supposed to be sick with spattergroit to explain his absence from school, the ghoul was transformed to look like Ron with pustules, creating an alibi that would hold up under casual inspection. These small domestic magics showed how wizarding families integrated spells into daily life, using magic not just for dramatic moments but for the mundane task of living, making the magical world feel lived in rather than just spectacular. Cho Chang dated Cedric Diggory and grieved his death through Harry's 5th year, her emotional state making their brief romance complicated and ultimately unsustainable. She cried frequently, wanted to talk about Cedric when Harry wanted to forget the graveyard, and struggled between moving forward and honoring her lost boyfriend's memory. Their kiss happened in Noun's, the room of requirement under mistletoe. Technically, Harry's first kiss, but emotionally fraught with grief and guilt, neither was ready to process. The films simplified Cho into a love interest who betrayed the DA, but in books it was her friend Marietta who told Umbridge, and Cho's defense of that friend ended her relationship with Harry more than any deliberate betrayal. Cho represented how grief complicated everything, how trauma didn't follow convenient timelines, how two hurt people reaching for each other couldn't always bridge their separate pain. She'd sought comfort in Harry because he'd been the last person to see Cedric alive, and Harry had liked her partly because she represented normalcy, a connection to life before Voldemort's return when his biggest problems were homework and Quidditch. Their relationship failing taught Harry that attraction wasn't enough, that timing mattered, that some connections couldn't overcome the circumstances that brought people together. Cho married a Muggle eventually, building a life outside the trauma that had defined her Hogwarts years, finding happiness that didn't require carrying someone else's grief alongside her own. Victor Krum was a professional Quidditch player at 18, already famous throughout the wizarding world when he arrived at Hogwarts for the Triwizard Tournament. He'd played Seeker for Bulgaria in the World Cup, catching the snitch even while his team lost, demonstrating that personal achievement didn't always align with collective victory. The films showed him primarily as Hermione's date to the Yule Ball, missing his depth as someone who struggled with fame he'd never sought, who found Hogwarts refreshing because students there saw him as fellow competitor rather than celebrity. His attraction to Hermione came from her treating him as person rather than famous athlete, from her intelligence and her complete indifference to Quidditch, from the way she challenged him intellectually instead of fawning over his accomplishments. Krum's relationship with Hermione sparked Ron's jealousy, forcing Ron to acknowledge feelings he'd been ignoring, creating tension that wouldn't resolve for years. Victor invited Hermione to visit Bulgaria, maintained correspondence after the tournament ended, and remained friendly even when she chose Ron, showing maturity that transcended typical teenage romantic drama. His suspicions about Professor Karkaroff being a Death Eater proved accurate, and his participation in the final task showed courage, despite having no stake in the outcome beyond personal pride. Victor represented how fame could isolate, how being excellent at something could make genuine connection difficult, how kindness mattered more than achievement when building relationships that lasted beyond moments of glory. Lavender Brown dated Ron during their 6th year, a relationship that existed primarily in public displays of affection that embarrassed Ron and hurt Hermione. Lavender called Ron 1-1, covered him with kisses in corridors, and expected constant attention that Ron initially enjoyed but quickly found suffocating. The relationship began from Ron's wounded pride after hearing Hermione had kissed Victor Krum, his jealousy manifesting as aggressive dating of someone who was enthusiastically available rather than frustratingly ambiguous. The films reduced Lavender to comic relief, but the books showed her genuine feelings, how her affection was real even if the relationship was founded on Ron's emotional confusion. When Ron was poisoned and called for Hermione while unconscious, Lavender realized she'd been placeholder rather than priority, leading to their breakup that Ron handled poorly, avoiding confrontation by simply ignoring her until she gave up. Lavender died or was severely injured in the Battle of Hogwarts, attacked by Fenrir Greyback. Her fate somewhat ambiguous in the books, but tragic regardless. A reminder that characters who seemed like comic relief were still people with complete lives and futures that war destroyed. Her relationship with Ron, though ultimately shallow, served purpose in forcing both Ron and Hermione to acknowledge that their feelings for each other existed and mattered. That watching the other person with someone else hurt in ways that friendship alone couldn't explain. Percy Weasley chose his career at the Ministry over his family, siding with Fudge when the Ministry denied Voldemort's return, believing that his job and ambitions mattered more than loyalty to people who embarrassed him with their poverty and their politics. He'd always been pompous and rule-following, valuing achievement and respectability, making him an outsider in a family that prioritized loyalty and humor over success. When the Ministry sent him to spy on Dumbledore, and Percy accepted, reporting his family's activities to his superiors, the Weasleys considered it betrayal that cut deeper than simple disagreement. The films reduced Percy to brief appearances, missing his years-long estrangement from his family, the letters he sent that Molly kept hoping he'd return, the pride that prevented him from admitting he'd been wrong, even when evidence of Voldemort's return became undeniable. Percy's return during the Battle of Hogwarts, making a joke that caused Fred to laugh just before Fred died, gave Percy both reconciliation and immediate devastating loss, teaching him in the cruelest way that family mattered more than career, that he'd wasted years of potential relationship on pride and ambition. His character arc showed how good people could make terrible choices, how family conflict arose from different values rather than lack of love, how pride could isolate someone from the people who would have supported them if they'd only allowed it. Arthur Weasley's fascination with Muggle objects made him endearing to readers and confusing to his pureblood colleagues at the Ministry. He collected plugs and batteries, enchanted a Ford Anglia to fly, asked Harry endless questions about how things worked without magic, genuinely curious about how Muggles accomplished anything without spells. His job at the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts office paid poorly, but suited his interests, though his fascination sometimes manifested as condescension, treating Muggle ingenuity as charming rather than equally valid. The films showed Arthur's warmth but missed his complexity, his position at the Ministry that should have been more senior given his experience but wasn't because he refused to treat Muggle-borns as inferior. His marriage to Molly that worked despite their frequent arguments about his tinkering. When Nagini attacked Arthur at the Department of Mysteries, nearly killing him, it revealed Voldemort's connection to the snake and Harry's connection to Voldemort, changing everything about how they understood the link between them. Arthur's survival required Muggle stitches, because magical healing couldn't close wounds made by dark creatures, forcing wizards to accept that Muggle medicine had value that magic couldn't replicate. His goodness was consistent throughout the series, a father figure to Harry who showed that being good didn't require being perfect, that you could have biases and still work to overcome them, that kindness mattered more than being right. Molly Weasley's Boggart took the form of her family members dead, her greatest fear being that she'd lose the people she loved to war she couldn't prevent. She'd lost both her brothers in the first war against Voldemort, grief that made her fiercely protective of her children, sometimes smotheringly so, unable to separate reasonable caution from paralyzing fear. The films showed Molly primarily as warm mother figure, missing her steel, the fierceness that made her duel Bellatrix Lestrange and win, shouting, "Not my daughter, you bitch," when Bellatrix tried to kill Ginny. Molly's relationship with her children was complicated by her tendency to favor some and criticize others, praising Bill and Charlie while being disappointed in the twins' choices, creating dynamics that her children navigated throughout their lives. She'd been poor her entire adult life, raising 7 children on Arthur's inadequate salary, performing magic that made meals stretch and clothes last. Her resourcefulness born from necessity rather than choice. When she knitted Harry a Weasley sweater his first Christmas, marking him as family through simple gift, it meant more than expensive presents could have, showing acceptance that Harry had never experienced. Molly represented maternal love in all its complexity. Protective and sometimes overbearing, unconditional yet with expectations, fierce enough to kill anyone who threatened her children, soft enough to cry over their departures for school each September. The Weasley family clock had hands for each member showing their location and status, with positions including home, school, work, traveling, lost, hospital, prison, and mortal peril. During the war, every hand pointed to mortal peril constantly, the clock acknowledging what everyone knew, that simply existing in a world where Voldemort had returned meant perpetual danger. The films never showed this clock, missing a detail that illustrated how magical families integrated enchantment into daily life, using magic not for drama, but for the simple comfort of knowing where loved ones were. Molly glanced at the clock compulsively, checking and rechecking even though the hands rarely moved from their ominous position, unable to stop herself from looking even when the information never changed. The clock represented how war transformed ordinary life, how tools meant for convenience became sources of constant anxiety, how knowing everyone you loved was in danger didn't prepare you for actually losing them. When the war ended, the hands finally moved away from mortal peril, dispersing to home and work and travel, showing life returning to patterns that didn't revolve around survival, proving that peace meant more than just victory, but the ability to exist without constant fear. Lupin's lycanthropy made him unemployed and poor, unable to hold jobs once employers learned he was a werewolf. Society's prejudice ensuring that a condition he couldn't control defined his entire existence. He'd been the best defense against the dark arts teacher Hogwarts had in years, patient and knowledgeable, but Snape's reveal of his condition to students ensured his resignation, proving that competence meant nothing when fear overrode reason. The films showed Lupin's transformation, but not the daily reality of living as werewolf in a society that treated lycanthropy as moral failing rather than medical condition. He couldn't get new robes when his grew shabby, couldn't afford proper lodging, existed on the margins of wizarding society because people like him weren't allowed to fully participate. His marriage to Tonks happened despite his resistance, his belief that he condemned her to poverty and prejudice, that his condition made him unworthy of love. When he tried to abandon his pregnant wife, offering to help Harry hunt Horcruxes instead of facing fatherhood, it showed how thoroughly society's rejection had convinced him of his own worthlessness. Lupin's friendship with James, Sirius, and Peter had given him years where he felt almost normal, where his friends became animagi illegally, just to keep him company during transformations, proving that love could overcome fear when people chose compassion over prejudice. His death in the Battle of Hogwarts alongside Tonks ensured their son grew up orphaned, repeating cycles of loss that seemed to define the wizarding world's relationship with those it deemed different. Tonks's metamorph magus abilities allowed her to change her appearance at will, shifting hair color and facial features based on mood or preference, making her uniquely suited for horror work requiring disguise. Her naturally clumsy personality contrasted with her professional competence, creating someone who tripped over umbrella stands but could duel Death Eaters effectively. The films cast her perfectly but reduced her presence, missing her year of depression when Lupin rejected her, when her hair lost its usual pink brightness and stayed mousy brown, when her Patronus changed from a jackrabbit to a wolf matching Lupin's form. Tonks represented how love could be persistent without being pathetic, how she pursued Lupin not from desperation but from genuine recognition of worth he couldn't see in himself, refusing to accept his self-loathing as reason to stop loving him. Her family had disowned her mother Andromeda for marrying a Muggle-born, making Tonks part of the Black family tree but rejected by most of it, giving her insight into how pure-blood ideology destroyed families from within. When she died, her parents raised Teddy, continuing cycles of grandparents raising orphaned grandchildren, proving that war's damage extended beyond immediate casualties to generations of disrupted lives and stolen futures. The prophecies' full text stated that the one with power to vanquish the Dark Lord would be born at July's end to parents who'd defied Voldemort 3 times, that the Dark Lord would mark him as equal, and that one must die at the other's hand. Voldemort heard only the first part, learning enough to fear but not enough to understand, and his attempt to prevent it by killing Harry created the very circumstances that made it come true. The films showed prophecy's destruction but didn't fully explore Dumbledore's teaching about choice, how Neville could have been the chosen one if Voldemort had attacked him instead, how the prophecy gained power only through Voldemort's decision to act on it. Harry carried the burden of knowing he was either murderer or victim, that his destiny involved killing or being killed, that the prophecy had structured his entire life around this binary outcome. But the power Voldemort knew not wasn't some spectacular magic, but simply Harry's capacity for love, for self-sacrifice, for choosing others' welfare over his own survival. The prophecy represented how fear created self-fulfilling outcomes, how trying to prevent futures could cause them, how destiny existed not as fixed path, but as consequence of choices made by people who believed certain futures were inevitable. When Harry walked into the forest to die, accepting that he must be killed for Voldemort to become mortal, he fulfilled the prophecy through choice rather than fate, proving that even predetermined outcomes required willing participation. The Deathly Hallows were 3 objects that together supposedly made their owner master of death: the Elder Wand, the Resurrection Stone, and the Cloak of Invisibility. Dumbledore had sought them in his youth alongside Grindelwald, their quest for Hallows representing desire for power that could transcend mortality, ambition that his sister's death taught him to reject. Harry possessed all 3 at the end without seeking them, inheriting the cloak from his father, winning the wand's allegiance by disarming Draco who'd disarmed Dumbledore, and finding the stone hidden in the snitch Dumbledore left him. The films showed the Hallows symbol, but simplified their significance, missing how they represented different approaches to death, dominating it through the wand, denying it through the stone, or accepting it through the cloak. Harry's wisdom came in choosing to keep only the cloak, leaving the stone in the forest where he'd dropped it, planning to let the wand's power die with him by dying undefeated. he understood what the tale's youngest brother knew: that avoiding death wasn't the same as defeating it, that true mastery came through acceptance rather than conquest, that living well mattered more than living forever. The Hallows symbol appeared throughout the series in retrospect, carved on graves and worn as jewelry, a reminder that important things existed in plain sight, waiting for those ready to understand their significance. Harry's sacrifice in the forest activated the same protection his mother had created, his willing death for those he loved making it impossible for Voldemort to harm them afterward. He'd walked to his death knowing he was a Horcrux, that Voldemort couldn't die while Harry lived, that destroying Voldemort required accepting his own destruction. The films showed this scene with appropriate gravity, but couldn't convey Harry's internal journey through the forest, surrounded by the dead he'd loved, using the Resurrection Stone to call his parents, Sirius and Lupin, to walk beside him. They couldn't really be there, were only echoes the stone created, but they gave him strength to continue forward, to face Voldemort without raising his wand in defense, to accept the killing curse without fighting back. His survival came from Voldemort having used Harry's blood to resurrect himself, linking their lives in ways Voldemort hadn't understood, allowing Harry to return from death's waiting room when Voldemort's curse destroyed only the piece of his soul that lived in Harry. The conversation with Dumbledore at King's Cross existed in Harry's mind or somewhere beyond, offering explanation and choice: stay dead or return to finish what he'd started. Harry's decision to return, to continue fighting despite having earned rest, showed heroism that transcended prophecy or obligation. Choice made freely to protect a world that had often treated him poorly. Snape's memories revealed in the pensieve showed his entire double life. His love for Lily that never faded. His devastation when Voldemort killed her despite his begging for her life. He'd gone to Dumbledore broken, willing to do anything if Dumbledore would protect her. And when he failed, when Lily died anyway, Snape transferred that protection to Harry, despite his hatred of James, despite his resentment that the boy lived while Lily didn't. The films captured this revelation beautifully through The Prince's Tale, but even they had to compress years of double agency, of maintaining occlumency shields so perfect that Voldemort never suspected, of committing terrible acts to maintain his position while secretly undermining Death Eaters whenever possible. Snape's Patronus being a doe, same as Lily's, was the proof Dumbledore required of his true loyalty, showing love that death couldn't kill, devotion that lasted decades without hope of reciprocation. His treatment of Harry made more sense knowing he saw James's face and Lily's eyes, torn between protecting the child and resenting the reminder of what he'd lost. Snape's courage operated in shadows, unrecognized and unappreciated, requiring him to be hated by everyone, trusted by no one except Dumbledore, living every day knowing that one mistake would mean agonizing death. His last words to Harry were, "Look at me," wanting to see Lily's eyes one final time, dying with that image as his last sight, carrying his love into whatever came after death. The Elder Wand's allegiance passed through winning rather than murder, a fact that saved Harry's life when his Expelliarmus overpowered Voldemort's Avada Kedavra in their final duel. Voldemort had killed Snape believing that would make him the wand's master, not understanding that Snape had never won it from Dumbledore, that Draco's disarming of Dumbledore had made Draco the master, that Harry's defeat of Draco had transferred allegiance to Harry. The films showed this revelation but simplified the wand lore, missing the elegant magic where murder meant nothing compared to genuine victory, where taking the wand by force was less powerful than winning it through skill. The wand itself was just wood, its power coming from allegiance granted through complex rules that even Ollivander didn't fully understand. Magic older than memory, determining who could wield which wand most effectively. Harry's decision to keep the wand temporarily only to repair his phoenix feather wand, then hide the Elder Wand in Dumbledore's tomb, showed wisdom beyond his years. Understanding that power that attracted seekers would only create more violence, that the cycle of murder and theft would continue unless someone chose to remove the wand from circulation. The wand represented how power corrupted those who sought it, how the most dangerous weapons were those that promised dominance, how true strength came from knowing when to refuse power rather than how to obtain it. Dumbledore's death was planned between him and Snape, a mercy killing that spared Dumbledore's slow death from the curse on the Horcrux ring while preserving Draco's soul by preventing him from becoming murderer. The films showed Dumbledore's plea, "Severus, please," as begging for life. But readers understood it was begging Snape to follow through with their plan, to commit the murder they'd agreed upon to save Draco and maintain his cover as loyal Death Eater. Dumbledore's trust in Snape was absolute, requiring Snape to do something that would make everyone hate him, that would mark him as traitor and murderer, that would ensure his legacy was villainy rather than heroism. The curse from the ring was already killing Dumbledore slowly, his hand blackened and dead, his time limited regardless of Snape's actions, making the choice between painful deterioration and quick death from someone he trusted. Dumbledore's acceptance of death as next great adventure made him willing to die when it served purpose, when his death would protect others and advance the fight against Voldemort. His portrait in the headmaster's office allowed some continuation, a magical echo that could advise future headmasters. But everyone knew portraits were only shadows of the original, lacking the depth and power that made Dumbledore himself so formidable. His funeral brought the wizarding world together in mourning, acknowledging that their greatest protector was gone, that whatever came next would happen without his guidance. The Battle of Hogwarts began when Harry returned to search for Ravenclaw's diadem, Voldemort learning of his presence and surrounding the school with Death Eaters, demanding Harry's surrender. The films showed spectacular combat but compressed hours of fighting into montage, missing how the battle developed in stages, how there was time for grief between assaults, how students and teachers fought side by side against forces that should have overwhelmed them. McGonagall animated the suits of armor to defend the castle. Sprout and the herbology students threw dangerous plants from the greenhouses. Slughorn arrived with reinforcements from Hogsmeade, and house-elves led by Creature poured from the kitchens with knives raised. The castle itself became weapon, its staircases moving to confuse invaders, its passages hiding defenders, its stones absorbing curses meant for living targets. 50 people died that night, their names deserving to be remembered even though the books didn't list them all, each death a permanent loss that victory couldn't restore. Fred died laughing. Lupin and Tonks died together, leaving Teddy orphaned. Colin Creevey died after sneaking back to fight though he was underage, proving that bravery existed across all ages and capabilities. The battle represented how war consumed everyone it touched, how fighting for what was right still meant losing what was precious, how victory always cost more than anyone wanted to pay. 19 years later, Harry sent his children to Hogwarts from Platform 9 3/4, marking healing and continuation, showing that life after trauma involved building futures rather than dwelling on past. He'd married Ginny, worked as an Auror, maintained friendships with Ron and Hermione who'd married each other, creating the family he'd always wanted, proving that orphans could become parents who didn't repeat the mistakes of those who'd raised them. The films showed this epilogue scene faithfully, though the aging makeup attracted mockery, capturing the essential message that those who survived built lives worth surviving for. Harry's scar hadn't hurt in 19 years, Voldemort truly gone. The dark mark no longer burning on former Death Eater's arms, the fear that had defined a generation finally lifting. His children worried about normal things, sorting into proper houses, making friends, succeeding at school, concerns that showed how completely the world had changed when war ended. Harry told his son Albus that Severus Snape was the bravest man he'd ever known, honoring a truth that few others would accept, ensuring Snape's sacrifice was remembered even if it couldn't be publicly celebrated. The epilogue represented hope that even after terrible loss, people could find happiness, that endings could be gentle rather than tragic, that those who fought darkness could live to see light, that magic existed not just in spells and prophecies, but in the simple fact of continuing forward into futures earned through sacrifice and courage. The Hogwarts house-elves numbered over 100, working in kitchens and maintaining the castle, their magic different from wizards in fundamental ways that most magical folk never bothered to understand. House-elf magic didn't require wands, operated on different principles, could accomplish things that wizard magic couldn't replicate, yet wizards dismissed it as lesser because it came from beings they'd enslaved. Dobby's freedom made him an anomaly, a house elf who chose his own path, negotiated wages, and wore whatever mismatched clothes pleased him, living proof that house elves were capable of independence if given the opportunity. Kreacher's transformation from hateful to loyal showed that even house elves raised in prejudice could change when treated with dignity, that respect could heal damage caused by generations of abuse. The films showed house elves sparingly, missing the complex relationship between wizards and the beings who made their comfortable lives possible. The moral questions about a society built on servitude, even when that servitude was magically compelled. Hermione's SPEW campaign was dismissed as foolish, but her understanding that enslaved beings deserved freedom regardless of whether they wanted it challenged foundations of wizarding culture. The house elves who fought in the Battle of Hogwarts, led by Kreacher who'd learned to value Harry and his friends, showed that loyalty given freely was stronger than loyalty magically compelled, that the castle's protectors included those usually invisible, that revolution came from recognizing the dignity in those society taught you to ignore. Hagrid's pink umbrella contained the pieces of his broken wand, allowing him to perform magic despite his expulsion, a secret Dumbledore had permitted, though it technically violated Hagrid's punishment. The Ministry had snapped Hagrid's wand when they expelled him for allegedly opening the Chamber of Secrets, Tom Riddle's frame-up costing Hagrid his education and his legal right to practice magic. That Dumbledore allowed Hagrid to keep the wand pieces showed his understanding that Hagrid was innocent, that some rules deserved quiet circumvention when they perpetuated injustice. Hagrid's magic was limited and often uncontrolled, his spells going wrong as often as right, but he could light fires and perform small enchantments necessary for his work. The films showed the umbrella occasionally, but never explained its significance, missing how it represented Hagrid's entire complicated relationship with magic and authority. He'd been allowed to stay at Hogwarts only as gamekeeper, a position that kept him close to the world he loved while marking him as separate from the fully magical community. His giant heritage made him an outsider among wizards. His wizard blood made him unusual among giants, leaving him belonging completely nowhere except Hogwarts, the castle that had been his home since he was 13, and remained his home until his last days. Hagrid's loyalty to Dumbledore was absolute because Dumbledore had given him a place when everyone else had rejected him, and that loyalty never wavered, even when it meant facing dragons or Death Eaters or carrying what he believed was Harry's dead body from the forest. The Forbidden Forest stretched for miles beyond Hogwarts grounds, home to centaurs who read the future in stars, acromantulas descended from Hagrid's Aragog, unicorns whose blood could sustain life at terrible cost, and creatures dangerous and magical in equal measure. Students were forbidden from entering without permission, though Harry ventured in repeatedly, to save the Philosopher's Stone, to follow spiders to Aragog, to meet Grop, to walk to his death. The forest represented the unknown and dangerous, the wild that existed beyond civilization's control, magic that predated Hogwarts and would outlast it. The centaurs lived there in herds, proud and dismissive of human magic, reading fates they rarely shared because wizards didn't deserve their knowledge. Firenze taught divination after Umbridge fired Trelawney, his willingness to work with humans making him an exile from his herd, showing how crossing cultural boundaries came with costs even when done for good reasons. The forest at night was entirely dark, sounds carrying strangely through trees that grew close together, the canopy blocking starlight, creating an environment where anything could hide just beyond your wand light's reach. The films showed the forest's exterior, but rarely ventured deep into its shadows, missing how it felt to be surrounded by ancient magic that didn't care about human conflicts or concerns, how the forest reminded wizards that they didn't control everything, that some places remained wild regardless of how much magic you wielded. The Mirror of Erised showed the deepest desire of whoever looked into it, showing Harry his family when he was 11 and alone, showing Ron himself as head boy and Quidditch champion when he felt overshadowed, showing Dumbledore holding socks when Harry asked though Dumbledore admitted to lying. The mirror's inscription read, "Erased stra eru oit ubecafru oit onworsi," which reversed read, "I show not your face but your heart's desire," explaining its function through wordplay. The films showed the mirror beautifully, Harry seeing his parents waving, but didn't explore Dumbledore's warning that men had wasted away before it, choosing to live in visions of what could never be, rather than accepting reality. The mirror revealed character through desire. Harry wanted family. Ron wanted achievement. Quirrell saw himself presenting the Philosopher's Stone to Voldemort. Dumbledore's enchantment ensured that only someone who wanted to find the stone but not use it could retrieve it from the mirror. Magic that protected against ambition by rewarding only those who lacked it. The mirror represented how desire could trap you, how wanting things you couldn't have could prevent you from appreciating what you did have, how the deepest magic often came from understanding yourself well enough to resist temptation. After that year, Dumbledore moved the mirror somewhere safe, removing the temptation from the school, understanding that not all knowledge was beneficial, that sometimes the kindest thing was to prevent people from seeing truths they couldn't handle. Platform 9 3/4 represented the threshold between ordinary and extraordinary, requiring faith to walk through solid barrier into the magical world beyond. Muggleborns approached it with trepidation, purebloods with casual familiarity, and everyone with some degree of wonder that magic made the impossible routine. The barrier sometimes closed, as when Dobby sealed it to prevent Harry and Ron from reaching the train, forcing them to fly the Ford Anglia to school in a choice that seemed reasonable at the time but caused tremendous trouble. The films showed the platform's magic without exploring what it meant to stand before a brick wall. Knowing you had to run toward it, trusting it would let you through. How that leap of faith represented everything about entering the wizarding world. Parents who couldn't accompany their children through the barrier had to say goodbye on the Muggle side, trusting their children to a world they might not fully understand, watching them disappear into what looked like solid stone. The Hogwarts Express departed at 11 o'clock on September 1st, arriving at Hogsmeade Station after dark, the journey marking transition from summer freedom to school structure, from family to friendship, from one version of yourself to whoever you'd become by journey's end. The Scarlet steam engine was old-fashioned even in the magical world, but tradition mattered more than efficiency. The train ride itself part of the Hogwarts experience, hours of anticipation and candy, and watching landscape transform from familiar to magical. Dumbledore's Phoenix Fawkes could carry immense loads despite his delicate appearance, cry tears that healed any wound, and burst into flames when it was time to be reborn from his own ashes. He'd come to Harry in the Chamber of Secrets, bringing the sorting hat that contained Gryffindor's sword, healing the basilisk's venom with his tears, offering his tail feathers for Harry and Voldemort's wand cores. The films showed Fawkes beautifully, his scarlet and gold plumage magnificent, but couldn't fully convey the comfort of his presence. How his song brought peace in darkness, how his loyalty to Dumbledore was absolute until Dumbledore died, and Fawkes left Hogwarts forever, his song echoing one final time before he disappeared to wherever phoenixes go when their wizard passes. The phoenix represented resurrection and loyalty, hope that even from ashes new life could emerge, faith that death was transformation rather than ending. Fawkes had been with Dumbledore for decades, a companion who never judged and always returned, whose burning days came cyclically, whose rebirth made him immortal in ways that wizards could only envy. When he left, it marked the true end of Dumbledore's era, the castle feeling emptier without his occasional song, students realizing that some losses were permanent, even in a world where portraits spoke and ghosts wandered. The phoenix feather in Harry's wand connected him to Fawkes and to Voldemort, creating the priori incantatem effect that saved Harry's life in the graveyard, showing how even the smallest magical connections could have profound consequences when circumstances aligned. Gryffindor's sword appeared to any Gryffindor who showed true courage in need, presenting itself from the sorting hat when Neville faced Voldemort's final challenge. The sword was goblin-made, taking in only what made it stronger, which meant it had absorbed basilisk venom when Harry used it to kill the serpent in the Chamber of Secrets, making it capable of destroying Horcruxes. The films showed the sword but simplified its properties, missing how it represented Gryffindor's values made tangible, how courage was rewarded with the tools to continue being courageous, how the Founders' magic persisted centuries after their deaths. Snape had hidden the real sword and given a fake to Death Eaters, then led Harry to find it frozen in a pool where recovering it required bravery and nearly resulted in drowning. Ron destroyed the Locket Horcrux with the sword, facing visions of his deepest fears while doing so, proving his worth in ways that mattered more than prophecies or chosen one status. The sword appeared when needed but couldn't be summoned or claimed, magic that operated on principles of deserving rather than wanting, showing that the best tools came to those who'd earned them through character rather than those who sought them for power. Griphook, the goblin, argued that the sword belonged to goblins regardless of Gryffindor's ownership, raising questions about property and creation that the books acknowledged without fully resolving, showing how different cultures viewed objects and ownership through incompatible frameworks. The Whomping Willow was planted the year Remus Lupin started at Hogwarts, hiding the passage to the Shrieking Shack where he transformed each full moon, its violent branches ensuring that no students accidentally wandered into a werewolf's territory. The tree attacked anyone who came close, its branches powerful enough to damage cars and break bones, magical defenses that served their purpose for years until Sirius showed Ron's rat the secret of freezing it. The films showed the willow attacking the flying car and later revealing Lupin's passage, but didn't explain its origin or purpose, missing how it represented Dumbledore's accommodation of Lupin's condition, how the school had been modified to allow a werewolf student to attend safely. The tree stood on the grounds like a guard, its branches moving constantly, ready to strike anything that triggered its defenses, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. Students gave it wide berth. First years were warned to stay away, and everyone knew that approaching the willow meant accepting you might be hospitalized. The secret of its knot that froze the branches was known only to the Marauders, and later revealed to those who needed to know. Another example of how Hogwarts held layers of secrets, how the castle and grounds were built on hidden purposes that most students never suspected. When the willow was damaged during the Battle of Hogwarts, it continued fighting, its magical nature making it ally against invaders, proving that even trees could choose sides when properly enchanted. Madame Pomfrey healed everything from minor cuts to major curses in the hospital wing, her expertise and dedication ensuring that student injuries rarely resulted in permanent damage. She'd mended Harry's bones after they were accidentally removed by Lockhart, healed countless Quidditch injuries, dealt with the aftermath of potions accidents and spell practice gone wrong, all while maintaining that students shouldn't be allowed near anything dangerous, then treating them efficiently when they inevitably were. The films showed her briefly but missed her character, her gruff kindness and complete competence, her insistence that patients rest, and her willingness to stand up to anyone who threatened her patient's recovery. The hospital wing smelled of cleaning potions and healing salves, its beds always available, its stores of skilligro and other remedies well stocked despite the constant demand. When students were petrified by the basilisk, Madame Pomfrey maintained them in suspended state until the mandrake restorative draught could be brewed, months of care for patients who couldn't wake. She represented the support infrastructure that made Hogwarts function, the adults who weren't teachers but were essential, whose work ensured that magical education's dangers remained mostly survivable. Her threats to ban Quidditch if injuries continued were never carried out, but students knew she meant them, that her primary concern was their well-being rather than their entertainment or glory. The Yule Ball required dress robes and dancing, creating social pressure that many students found more terrifying than dragons or dark magic. Harry's awkward invitation to Cho after she'd already accepted Cedric, Ron's disaster with Hermione after he'd assumed she'd go with him, and Neville's surprising success taking Ginny all showed how teenage romance complicated everything regardless of magical ability. The films showed the ball beautifully, the Great Hall transformed into Winter Wonderland, students dancing in their finest robes, but compressed the weeks of anxiety leading up to it, the agony of asking someone, and the social dynamics that made simple questions feel life-threatening. Hermione's appearance in blue robes, her hair styled beautifully, shocked Ron into finally seeing her as girl rather than just friend, though he expressed this realization through jealousy and rudeness rather than anything productive. The Weird Sisters performed, their magical rock music filling the hall, and students danced until midnight, enjoying brief respite from tournament dangers and academic pressures. The ball represented normalcy in abnormal circumstances, how even during dangerous tournaments, students still worried about normal teenage things, how growing up involved navigating social challenges alongside magical ones. Harry's misery at the ball, watching Cho dance with Cedric while trying to dance with Parvati despite having no idea how, showed that some types of suffering were universal regardless of whether you were fighting dark wizards or just trying to survive adolescence. The Triwizard Cup had been turned into a portkey by Barty Crouch Jr., transporting Harry and Cedric to the graveyard where Voldemort waited, transforming victory into tragedy in the instant they touched it together. Portkeys were objects enchanted to transport people who touched them at specific times to predetermined locations, a form of magical travel that felt like being hooked behind the navel and yanked forward. The films showed portkey travel visually, swirling colors and disorientation, capturing the unpleasant sensation the books described. Most portkeys were authorized through the Ministry, regulated to prevent misuse, but Crouch had created one illegally as part of the plan to deliver Harry to Voldemort. When Harry grabbed Cedric's body and the cup to return, the portkey's magic still worked, depositing them in front of the shocked crowd who'd been cheering moments before, creating the horror of celebration interrupted by death. The cup should have represented triumph, proof of magical skill and courage, but Crouch had perverted it into kidnapping device, showing how even objects meant for glory could be corrupted, how trust in institutions and symbols could be exploited by those willing to violate established rules. Harry's insistence on bringing Cedric's body back, refusing to leave him in the graveyard, showed honor that transcended survival instinct, choosing to honor the dead even when it meant prolonging his own danger. Cedric Diggory represented everything good about Hufflepuff: loyalty, fairness, dedication, kindness without weakness. He'd been popular and talented, Quidditch captain and prefect, someone who treated others with respect regardless of their status or house. His suggestion that Harry take the Triwizard Cup first, after they'd helped each other through the maze, showed his character, preferring that victory go to the person who'd earned it, rather than claiming glory he could have taken. When Harry insisted they take it together, Cedric agreed because fairness mattered more than individual achievement, a decision that cost him his life seconds later when they arrived in the graveyard. The films showed Cedric's death but couldn't convey the waste of it, how he'd been murdered simply for being present, how his last words were confusion about where they were, how he'd died without understanding why or having chance to fight. His father's grief at seeing the body, his insistence that Harry keep the Triwizard winnings, and his pride in his son despite the tragedy, showed how loss affected families, how parents survived knowing their children had died for no reason except being in the wrong place. Cedric's death marked the end of childhood innocence for Harry's generation, proof that Voldemort's return meant people they knew, people their own age, would die. That war didn't distinguish between those ready for it and those who'd simply been trying to succeed at school. The Room of Requirements version for hiding things had accumulated centuries of concealed objects, students, and staff, hiding everything from failed assignments to cursed artifacts to objects they simply didn't want found. When Harry hid the Half-Blood Prince's potions book there, marking its location with the bust wearing a wig and tiara, he was adding to layers of secrets that reached back to Hogwarts' founding. Ravenclaw's diadem had been hidden there by Tom Riddle decades earlier, concealed among so many other objects that finding it required knowing exactly what you sought. The films showed the room's vastness, but couldn't convey the history layered in those objects, the stories behind each hidden thing, the reasons people had chosen concealment over destruction or honesty. When Crabbe cast fiend fire during the battle, the cursed fire consumed everything indiscriminately. Centuries of secrets burning together, the room itself nearly destroyed by magic too powerful to control. The fire killed Crabbe, nearly killed Draco and Goyle, destroyed one of Voldemort's Horcruxes, and eliminated countless historical artifacts, showing how dark magic wielded without understanding destroyed user and surroundings without discrimination. Harry saving Draco from the fire, pulling him onto the broomstick while flames roared around them, showed that even enemies deserved rescue when death threatened, that some choices transcended old grudges when life hung in the balance. Nicolas Flamel created the Philosopher's Stone, achieving immortality through alchemy that most wizards considered impossible, living over 600 years before choosing to destroy the stone rather than let it fall into Voldemort's hands. His partnership with Dumbledore showed friendship spanning centuries, two brilliant minds appreciating each other's achievements, willing to sacrifice immortality rather than allow it to be corrupted. The films showed the stone as a plot device, but didn't explore Flamel's character or the magnitude of his decision. How choosing mortality after 6 centuries of life required accepting an end he'd avoided since the Middle Ages. Dumbledore's letter explaining that Flamel and his wife Perenelle would die after setting their affairs in order treated death as natural conclusion rather than tragedy, showing philosophy that Harry wouldn't fully understand until years later when he walked into the forest to face Voldemort. The stone represented how even immortality was temporary if you valued anything more than your own survival, how the greatest achievements could be sacrificed if principles demanded it, how choosing to die for the right reasons required more courage than choosing to live. Flamel's legacy wasn't the stone, but his willingness to destroy it, proving that wisdom came from knowing when to let go rather than how to hold on forever. The Resurrection Stone could summon shades of the dead, echoes that seemed real but weren't, couldn't truly return to life because death remained irreversible even for the Hallow's power. Harry used it in the forest before facing Voldemort, calling his parents, Sirius and Lupin, to walk beside him toward death, finding comfort in their presence even knowing they were only shadows the stone created. The films showed this scene beautifully, the figures appearing in the forest, telling Harry they were proud and would stay with him, giving him strength to continue forward. The stone's danger came from its temptation, from wanting the dead to return so badly that you'd accept shadows as substitute for real people, living in the past rather than accepting loss and moving forward. The second brother in the tale killed himself to truly join the woman the stone had brought back as shade, showing how desire to reclaim what death had taken could destroy those who couldn't accept that some separations were permanent. Harry dropped the stone in the forest after using it, choosing not to search for it after the battle, understanding that keeping it would mean perpetual temptation to live among the dead rather than with the living. The stone represented how grief could trap you, how love for those lost could become unhealthy if you couldn't let them go, how the healthiest response to death was remembering while continuing to live rather than trying to reverse what couldn't be changed. The final truth that Voldemort could never understand was that love, freely given and reciprocated, created magic more powerful than any dark spell or Horcrux or ancient artifact. His inability to comprehend this came from his own loveless existence, his mother having conceived him under love potion's influence, his childhood in an orphanage without affection, his deliberate choice to view love as weakness rather than strength. Every protection Harry had came from love. His mother's sacrifice, the friendships he'd built, the people willing to die for him, and for whom he was willing to die. The films showed this theme but couldn't fully explore how thoroughly it ran through the entire story. How every major magical achievement Harry accomplished came through love rather than power, through connection rather than domination. Voldemort's Horcruxes represented his refusal to accept mortality, his determination to exist forever regardless of cost, fragmenting his soul until he barely qualified as human. Harry's willingness to die represented the opposite philosophy, accepting that some things mattered more than survival, that mortality gave life meaning, that love was worth dying for in ways that power never could be. The final battle's outcome was determined before wands were raised, decided by choices made years earlier about what mattered and what didn't, about whether to split your soul for immortality or keep it whole and accept death when it came. Voldemort fell because he'd built everything on foundations of fear and power, which crumbled when faced with someone who'd built everything on love and sacrifice, proving that the oldest magic was the strongest, that what seemed soft was actually unbreakable, that those willing to die for others held a power that those who'd kill for themselves could never match.